So with all of that, setting the stage, I want to introduce our next two speakers. And they're going to talk about Generation Z. They're from the Overlake School, and they participated with Citizens Climate Lobby, Kunal, Sinha, and Adam Goodman.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. As has already been said, my name is Adam and this is Kunal, and we're both members of Generation Z, which means we're somewhere between the ages of 2 and 22.
It's our generation that at the end of the day has to bear the brunt of climate change. So it makes sense to understand how we're actually going to respond to that, which is actually what we're talking about today.
First, please allow for a more formal introduction. Kunal and I are both seniors at the Overlake School, which is out east in Redmond. It's a bit of a smaller private school, and it's also where we're both the leaders of our school's environmental club. Along with classes, we're really passionate about sports such as cross country, extracurriculars such as debate, and clubs such as Fermentation Club, where we get to make kombucha and pickles. And although we have not been arrested yet, we're very passionate about our activism, and on a bit more of a milder side, we really like lobbying through the Citizens Climate Lobby. Here's a photo of some of our club members at the September 20th climate strike.
Speaking of those climate strikes, those are actually some of the largest big youth movements worldwide in the past 15 years. And it shows that most of the environmental movement nowadays is driven by youth and Generation Z. So again, it's critical we understand how we engage this key demographic and excite that fiery desire for activism. So as activists ourselves, we really value a couple of things. We value having honest conversations face-to-face like we're hopefully doing right now. We understand that many of our peers are busy, so we want to give them opportunities for meaningful work without major time commitments. And most importantly, we just want to spark enough interest so that even when we leave our small school community, there's been enough of a flame that's been kindled that activism can continue when we're gone.
However, we have not always been this passionate about climate change. I first remember hearing the term back in preschool when I was listening to NPR on the radio every day in my mom's car. Over conversation about the war in Iraq, various plane crashes, etc., I heard this term called climate change, and when I asked my mom about what it meant, she intuitively told me that the Earth was getting warmer, and we really didn't have a good way of knowing how to stop it. Ever since then, I've pondered the various scenarios associated with this, such as, what if the Earth gets too warm, and what could I do to mitigate this? So, ever since a very young age, I'd say I had a pretty good comprehension of the effects climate change can have on our world. If only our 80-year-old politicians understood the same. I didn't become involved in activism until I joined an environmental club where I found that I really liked talking about different types of policy and solutions with others. After researching more policy, I joined the Citizens Climate Lobby because I really liked its bipartisan approach to solving this issue.
Before I even heard the term climate change, I could intuitively understand that something was going wrong. I remember when I was in 4th grade and my teacher would regale us with stories of Redmond back in the olden days, where it was essentially a giant farm with only one traffic light in the entire town. But more importantly, she'd talk about how the entire town would be covered with snow multiple times per year. And I remember that snow was an integral part of my childhood. Waking up for school, only to get that call from the principal that school was canceled, and then to run outside and throw snowballs at my friends and slide down the hill in cardboard boxes. It was incredibly fun. But then one day, the snow day simply didn't come. And the same thing happened the next year. In fact, the number of snow days dropped so quickly and so precipitously that such an important part of my childhood just disappeared overnight. And when I learned about climate change, I was fired up. I remember when I was in 5th grade, some students in a nearby school organized a fundraiser to promote education in Haiti. And I thought, I can organize my own fundraiser to make the world a better place in my own way. So I wanted to do a fundraiser to ending climate change. But when I got on the internet, the very first article I found when I searched up climate change was supposedly from the top climate scientist claiming that climate change was a hoax. And although I later realized that that was complete BS, what matters is in that moment, that passion for activism died out, at least temporarily. It's frustrating, but it taught me the power of misinformation, especially in our modern internet age.
Now that we know the powers of false propaganda in our environmental movement, we must ask ourselves, how can we, as a club and as a generation, prevent this and spread climate truth? At school, our club is known for using a variety of unconventional methods to recruit others and get their attention. Take, for example, a few weeks ago, during the club fair, where basically every club had the opportunity to come up on stage and talk about their club and pitch it. We decided to use Hootie the Owl suit. He's our mascot because we're the Overlake Owls. And we talked about he was very sad on stage because his forest burned down. Overall, it got a lot of people talking, and we were able to almost triple the amount of members in our club. We also like to practice activism using unconventional methods. You might remember last year, back in March, we had a Seattle climate school walkout, and being in Redmond, we really wanted to participate, but it wasn't really feasible because we couldn't walk all the way to Capitol Hill. We therefore decided to bring the activism to us by having what's called a demon dialing event. It's basically when you try to get as many people to call as many reps as possible in a given amount of time. So we set up a website that made it very easy for our students to figure out how to call their representatives on a state and local level, and also track and record their calls, and basically make it a competition when we put as many people as possible in the cafeteria to try to call them. Overall, we called 470 representatives in 2 hours, and it was really fun because even if you didn't know every single little intricacy about climate change or climate policy, you could still contribute to some meaningful work. Right now, we're also working on auditing the cars that come onto our campus to spark conversation about the amount of greenhouse gases contributed by transportation and to see what we can change about it.
But of course, our activism doesn't just live and die in our school, because you can't exactly spark a revolution with the about 400 students that are in our high school. So we started just by going out into Redmond and having conversations with Redmond business owners and citizens, talking about a reusable bag ordinance to replace the plastic bags in retailers with more reusable ones. Then we started speaking to the people in power. We had one-on-one meetings with the members of our Redmond City Council, and then we took it even a step further, where last year we attended a lobbying day where we spoke directly to Washington state senators and representatives, not just about reusable bags this time, but about 100% clean energy and orca protection and a ton of other really cool pieces of legislation. Some things worked out great, like the 100% clean energy bill actually passed in Washington. But a few other of our efforts, like the reusable bag ordinance, are currently stalled in Redmond City Council. And although we were less successful in that regard, we felt that politicians were still a bit more likely to listen to what we had to say as Generation Z, because after all, we make up the future of their constituents. But not everything we did involved just speaking to politicians. We also practice activism outside of school in sneakier ways, such as sneaking out of school to attend the September 20th climate strike.
However, what we do does not come without a variety of issues. Perhaps the most common issue that we run into every time we try to organize an event are bureaucratic inefficiencies. Take, for example, a tree planting day that we tried to have last year. Our school is pretty spread out and it has a lot of these grassy areas where there's not really anything growing there, and we wanted to reforest them and reintroduce native species. Even though we got permission from our club advisor to do this, the principal to do this, we even got funding from the development office to do this, it still ultimately got shut down by a different part of the administration for obscure financial reasons. We also learned that traveling is a huge liability, and every time we try to go somewhere, there are many loopholes to jump through as we are under 18. Unfortunately, it should theoretically be the easiest for us as a small private school to be able to host events just because there's less people to talk to in order to get something done. As institutions get larger, it can be harder for activists to organize things. Overall, we learned that communication is absolutely paramount whenever you're trying to host an event, and that it's important to loop in just about every single person who could even be minutely involved in the event to make sure that we're all on the same boat. Another thing that we learned that we have an issue specifically as Gen Zers is what we call sensory overload. As you may know, Generation Z has a notoriously small attention span, 2/3 that of millennials. And every day there are hundreds of hashtags and controversies swimming out there, which makes it fairly difficult for us to promote a relatively specific and narrow agenda as activists. We especially find this at our school, where there are many different clubs trying to get people to pay attention to them for a relatively small student body, and we have to compete with them to figure out how we can stand out.
So we realize that when we're competing for such short attention spans, we need to create a singular sort of snappy statement or image that someone can look at and get an entire sense of our narrative just in a split second. A good example is the plastic bag monster that Adam is wearing here, where you just need to look at it for 1 second and you can understand the basic message, that Americans are drowning in the obscene amount of plastic they use. And this is a pretty effective strategy because when we went to Capitol Hill, there were more pictures taken of Adam in that bag monster costume than there were of Senator Mona Das or Representative Joe Fitzgibbon. But there's another major challenge that we've unfortunately faced, and that is major ideological differences. And thankfully, I'm not talking about climate deniers because there are far fewer of them in Generation Z. What I'm mainly talking about is people who believe we need sweeping radical changes and everything else is a complete waste of time. And in a sense, it makes sense where this idea even comes from. Many in the older generations were fairly apathetic, and this fiery passion for sweeping change has emerged as a strong form of backlash in Generation Z. And not all of these large sweeping changes are even bad, and none of these people have good intentions. But if we start criticizing any sort of smaller pieces of legislation as completely useless and a waste of time, we're essentially leading to more infighting in the environmental community and creating a circular firing squad of sorts. And remember that when the fossil fuel lobby outspends us 10-1, we absolutely need to be united as environmental activists. And remember that smaller fixes are still pretty effective, because as long as they spark a conversation and generate interest, they can be used as stepping stones for larger and larger solutions.
So to conclude, being a Gen Zer and an activist is really fun. We're allowed to do things that previous generations couldn't have ever dreamed of, such as using social media to spread our word. It overall makes it a lot more efficient and effective to get our point across.
There are definitely some drawbacks, but there are also some major strengths. The first is obviously that Generation Z is much more aware and passionate about environmental issues than previous generations. But also, Generation Z is the most diverse generation in the history of the United States. So there is much more representation from previously underrepresented groups that disproportionately bear the brunt of climate change. You can like Gen Z or you can hate Gen Z, but we eventually will inherit the planet, and we're here to stay.